Good morning. I'm Mary Davey. I'm Jim Williams' assistant at Acquisition Excellence. I told him I wasn't coming unless there was a tiara involved, so he provided that.
Thank you, Mary, the queen of IT and my partner here. I'm the industry lead for Acquisition Excellence, and I have to tell you, it's been a ton of fun. I would like to ask that you all please stand for the national anthem.
Pledge of Allegiance?
Pledge of Allegiance.
Let's do it. We have to do it together. Oh, here we go. By the dawn's early light, what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleam, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight, o'er the ramparts we watched, were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? Wow. That was fantastic. Thank you all. This would be innovation, creativity. All right. That was great. Thank you, guys.
That was beautiful. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here. And this year, ACT-IAC, with the help of DHS, VA, Office of Federal Procurement Policy, and many other agencies are working together, as we always do, with our long-standing commitment to help government by doing it by collaboration between government and industry. And federal acquisition is particularly important. And let me stop for a minute and just say our thoughts and prayers go out to the people in Brussels this morning for the attacks that they've had there. And I think what we do here today, again, continuing to collaborate to make America better, making federal acquisition, which I've always believed is a critical part of our government, better, is important work. And it's important that we come together and talk about how do we make things better. And we particularly want to thank OFPP for their leadership in coming here to present their notable awards today. Our dialogue today will focus on innovation and acquisition, advancing the government and industry relationship, services acquisition, and cybersecurity. Mary?
That's right, Jim. The sessions we have designed for you today around those four topics really are focusing on finding ways to collaborate and give you all something to take away. We heard that loud and clear from the attendees last year. What they really liked was the interaction, the collaboration, and something that they could use when you go back to your job. So that part, the collaboration, as we all know, is one of the most important roles that ACT-IAC plays, and we want to continue to make sure that that happens, not only in this forum, but all the other forums that are put on. So we also have something this year called the Digital Mini Session, and you will hear from a number of folks from several different agencies that were part of the Digital Acquisition IT Corps, about 15 minutes each, so a series of lightning talks. Which will give you insight into some of the experiences that they had and some of the projects that they worked on. So those, again, related to the government's acquisition in the digital technology field. So with we'd like to recognize the Planning Committee. We had a great group of folks with a lot of energy, a lot of commitment to putting this on. We believe that we've got a fantastic program with a number of just outstanding speakers. So you can see all of the folks up there on the slide, and I'd like to ask you all to stand and be recognized. Thank you for your hard work. We also had a lot of fun doing that. And I also want to recognize Ted Davies and Margie Graves, our ACT-IAC chairs. If you all would stand, please. They are here today. You'll be hearing from Ted later in the day on a panel, and as we all know, Margie's just taken on a very new, important role in the Federal CIO's office, so we look forward to working with you there, Margie. Thank you for being here.
I'd also like to thank our sponsors and the media partners of Acquisition Excellence, in particular our strategic mission partner, AT&T. We can't put on this conference without all of their support, and I would like you to join me in also thanking the sponsors, the media partners, and also the agencies, DHS, DOD, VA, VA's Acquisition Academy, all of those people who helped bring this together. Please thank them. Mary, you forgot your crown.
Oh, put that back on. I took it off. All right. It is now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Greg Giddens. I think he was termed Mr. Fix-It. Is that what Jim told me on the Government Matters program over the weekend? Greg serves as the Chief Acquisition Officer for VA and VA's Principal Executive Director for the Office of Acquisition, Logistics, and Construction. He previously served as the Executive Director of VA's Office of Policy, Planning, Enterprise Program Management Office. He's held numerous roles throughout his career, including Director of DoD Acquisition Personnel Demonstration Project and Deputy Assistant Commandant for Acquisition, United States Coast Guard Headquarters. He's received several awards, including the Presidential Rank Award for Distinguished Executive. And Greg holds a Master's of Science in National Resource Strategy from the Industrial College of the Armed Forces, an MBA from Georgia College, and you'll definitely hear his Southern accent in his remarks this morning, as a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering from the Georgia Institute of Technology. So Greg, please join me up here, and thank you so much.
Thanks, Mary, Jim, Ted, Margie. Thanks for the opportunity to come and chat. It's great to be here and be the warm-up act for Claire. So stay tuned. I heard you mention a Southern accent. I don't hear it myself. Although you may. We did a quick trip to Georgia. I usually try to spend a little more time at spring break, but Jim told me I couldn't this year, that I had to come back. So I may have a little bit more of a drawl, perhaps, than usual, but it was great to go back and visit family. Jim mentioned Belgium. You know, that's the kind of world we're in. And I mentioned family. I'd encourage us all to kind of keep in mind what's important in our lives. The work we do, the work you do, the work ACT-IAC does is incredibly important. But in all things, there must be balance, and we need to realize, I would suggest, we need to realize how to think about keeping that best balance. It's great to be here this morning and talk about some of the work that we're doing at the VA. And speaking of that, we think about the VA and you think about veterans, and to some degree they start to get a little bit lost because when they take the uniform off, they're not as distinguishable as they are in uniform. But I'd like for all of those that are currently serving, I see some in uniform, all those currently serving or have served, to please stand. Thank you for your service. I'd also ask, in light of the events that unfolded early this morning, for those that have served or are serving in law enforcement to stand, or first responders. Anyone? That is surprising. There's usually a good mix of law enforcement and first responders. It may be that those that are currently serving are out at the front line today, which might be certainly appropriate. Well, unless you've been living where I grew up, you probably heard the VA in the news a little bit the past year or so. We've certainly uncovered things and have had things uncovered for us that we need to improve on. And to Bob McDonald and Sloan Gibson's credit, they're in the mode of owning that, owning our issues and working to resolve them. They came in with that particular attitude in mind. And I'll chat with you this morning some things to kind of give you context about what we're doing in the VA at large, and I'll eventually kind of drill down a little bit more on the acquisition and procurement side. And at the end, I want to make sure we got some time for questions. And maybe one of the questions could be, is there a difference between acquisition and procurement? So what do you think about that a little bit? Uncle Jim Williams, he already knows the answer to that question, but he knows the answer to most every question, right, Mary? That's kind of how Jim is. So let me walk you through the 5 things that the Secretary has really put us on in order to transform the department. And we use the transform word a lot. It's used in town a lot. He's using it clearly with purpose for us. And that he came in, looked at our strategic plan, looked at what we had talked about doing, and he said, the plan's pretty good. The issue is we're not executing well. We're really not focusing our resources and moving the organization forward. I was fortunate enough to be on a team when he first came in to work with him as he shaped this initiative called My VA. And at the crux of it, he wants the VA to be an organization that people see as theirs, whether they're veterans and they're getting services, or family members, other beneficiaries, or employees, whether they're VSOs, our stakeholders. He wants all those folks, all those stakeholders to see the VA as their VA, as My VA. He set out 5 pillars for us to focus on. The first one starts with improving the veteran experience. He came in and saw us as an organization that looks at ourselves from the inside out. We first look at our bureaucracy, and let me tell you, you may not think there's a lot of things we excel in. We excel in bureaucracy at the VA. You may be in an organization that thinks you're doing pretty good at that. I'll put us up against your organization any day. And he said, we're too focused on that. We look inside, and then we start looking out. And he's challenged us to think about the VA from the outside in. Right? How does the VA look at? How does the veteran look at the VA? How do they see us? They don't see us as an organizational chart that's got 45 boxes on it and dots and lines and dashes. They see us as one organization that's supposed to be focused on serving their needs. And we can't improve their experience unless we focus on their experience. So you're here today at an ACT-IAC conference, and I'm delighted to be here speaking. So here's the plug for ACT-IAC and some of the great work that you all have done. And I saw a couple people in the audience already that helped us with this. The first pillar is improving the veteran experience, and when we started, we reached out. GSA was great in helping us get started, and ACT-IAC was great in working with us over what Ken was several months. Lots of sessions, really helped us do some thinking about customer experience, about the veteran experience. Tom Allen we hired in from the outside as our Chief Veteran Experience Officer. He was new to the federal government. He'd been in customer experience, customer service industry. He'd been in the food industry. In fact, how many people heard the cheeseburger royale, right, from the Bond movies? And Tom Allen coined that phrase. He opened McDonald's up in Europe. So he had a lot of experience on customer service, and he's translating that to the veteran service. But ACT-IAC really pulled together for us and helped us get started our initial thinking and focus on the veteran experience. The second element is the employee experience. Bob McDonald, who was the prior CEO of Procter & Gamble, is no surprise, he's got a pretty good Rolodex of contacts. So he worked with us to go out and visit 7 or 8 companies that would be in the, if we were to poll, they'd be in your top 10 of customer service organizations. We went out and met with them to talk about customer service, and what they told us is they couldn't get the right customer service until they got the right employee experience. That their customer experience never took off until they got the right employee experience. So the employee experience is the second element of the My VA initiative. The third element is proving our support services, our enabling services, which is clearly the word of work that others are in at the department. And we talk about this in terms of front stage, on stage, and backstage. There's a lot of activity front stage and on stage, right, that the backstage enables. If you go to a play, if you go to a concert, you see the activity on the front stage, you see the action there, you see what's happening on stage. You don't see what's happening backstage, but is anything going on backstage? Has anything gone on backstage before the performance? So this is time for audience participation. So the answer is yes. Right. Thank you. Thank you. Right? So all that work in the backstage enables that great experience that you have. And that's the same way with us, looking at the veteran experience, employee experience, through that back office function, that backstage function, whether it's HR, whether it's procurement, acquisition, IT, financial management, all that enables the right experience for the veteran when they come to the VA. How do we improve that? How do we make that better? The fourth is about overall continuous improvement by using concepts like Lean and Lean Six Sigma. The Secretary has an engineering degree. I think that's pretty cool. And he came to this with really that kind of analytics in mind. How do we look at processes? How do we use data to drive changes in the process? How do we use a tool like Lean to help pull us together when we look at opportunities? And the last is strategic partnerships. I've been working to try to encourage the VA to get more engaged with ACT-IAC and other partnerships. We're also engaging with other organizations, NGOs that have a passion for serving veterans. And there's lots of opportunities out there. We're finding if we're open to partnering with organizations, we're not the only ones that have a passion for serving veterans. I'll give you a quick example. It's been probably now a couple years ago, we were working an issue in LA, and homelessness is still a huge issue for this country, although several cities, in fact, have ended street homelessness. We're working hard from the veteran perspective to end veteran homelessness. We're working an issue in LA where we were using HUD-VASH vouchers to put people in temporary housing. But as we did that, all we could do was provide the temporary housing. We couldn't provide any amenities, we couldn't stock the pantry, we couldn't provide furniture, we couldn't do anything. And what we found is veterans were now coming in to this temporary housing with nothing but their shopping cart. They didn't last long. They didn't have really kind of the core necessities to really establish themselves and use this temporary housing as the transition to get to permanent housing. It was not a good start for them. It was great that they're off the street, but it didn't position them in a way that they could really move toward permanent housing. The folks in LA were fortunate enough to link up with somebody that heard about that, an organization, and they started then donating, and all appropriately, us, HUD, everybody got all the right nods from, like 45 lawyers. I'm not saying that in a bad way, but right, you want to do things properly. And they started trying then to outfit this temporary housing. So now they come in, they've got some furnishing, they've got some amenities, they've got something in the pantry. Right? Now the odds greatly increase that these people will now really make the transition. That's something we couldn't do, HUD couldn't do. We were prohibited by appropriations law to provide funding for those types of efforts. You might say, well, that sounds strange, but probably not the first thing that sounds strange about appropriation law, right? But that's how it is. In the past, many times people would come to us and want to partner with us to serve veterans' needs, and we would tell them thanks, but we're not interested. It's our mission to serve veterans, and you just need to leave us alone. That's not what Bob McDonald and Sloan Gibson brought to the VA. They brought an openness, a confidence in what we're doing and what we will be doing to ask others to join in with us. So I want to take a few minutes to give you that context because that permeates really what we do at the VA. That's the 5 things that set us in motion on a strategic path. Now, to me, they sound really good. I think they're the absolute right 5, but by themselves, they won't guide us in the way that we can really make focused progress this FY. And so what we've done is focused on 12 breakthrough initiatives. We got 12 initiatives. Each one of these, either the Secretary, the Deputy, or our Chief of Staff have focused sessions with. And I mean focus sessions. I lead one of these, and the Deputy Secretary Sloan Gibson is the one of the 3 that tracks on supply chain. He is very engaged. We're having another session this afternoon. We're in the every week or every other week cycle with him based on his travel. And I just want to run down this 12 to give you a sense of what the focus is. But again, they're all in the context of the 5 pillars of the MyVA initiative. So the first is improving the veteran experience using data-driven, based on customer surveys, to really tackle that first pillar, improving the experience. The next is improving access to health care. It's an issue that we work to improve, and we found we still haven't done enough. When we looked in 15, from 14 to 15, we increased appointments over 7 million, and still found that was not enough. So in 1 year, we added 7 million appointments, but was not enough. What we're finding is the more that we provide access, whether that's in weekend hours or evening hours, or adding primary care physicians, or adding staff so a primary care physician can be more productive, that more veterans are coming, and the veterans that are coming more often. So if we were in a business with a profit bottom line, that'd be great. We could use this, go to our stakeholders, our owners, and get more investment. As you know, the appropriation cycle in town runs on a yearly, at best, cycle. Right? You're always in 3 cycles. You're executing now, you're planning for the next one, and you're doing programming for the one after. What we found, veterans make their decisions in a cycle time that's way inside of our do loop. We're trying to react with a longer term appropriation and authorization cycle, and veterans are making decisions this afternoon about what happens based on this morning. We got to somehow get more predictive to get ahead of that as we work to improve access. Improving community care. We can't do it all within the VA with our brick and mortar. How do we best leverage the community to provide care? Deliver a unified veterans experience. One of the things that's become crystal clear for us is it is just unacceptable for a veteran not to be able to call the VA and change their address. And you can't do that now. You can call VHA, or you can call the life insurance program, or you can call the claims program, but we don't have that in a centralized database. We need to deliver that unified experience for the veteran. We need to modernize our contact centers. How do we share that core information across the organization, but do that in a way that's secure? I know cyber and IT is one of the tracks here that's incredibly important. PII is incredibly important in protecting health information, but how do we do that in a way that we can share that across our business lines? Improving the compensation and pension exam, developing a simplified appeals process. We made a lot of progress on our disability claims over the past probably 3 or 4 years. 3 or 4 years ago, we had a backlog of about 620,000. It's about 75,000 now. Dramatic reduction. Redid processes, looked at staff, optimized, restructured how we work the claims, pumping out 1.4, 1.45 million claims a year, way over what we had done anything in the past for a couple of years. But what we're seeing happen as we squeeze this side of the services balloon, what we're seeing now is that work that's now been increased going through the disability claims process is now increasing the workload on the appeal side. We haven't seen an increase in the percentage of appeals, runs about 8 to 9%. But if your percentage stays the same, but your number increases, then your number of appeals increases. And what we're really working feverishly on now is how do we look at that appeals process before it gets to the backlog state that the disability claims were. The Secretary had a hearing last week on the Senate side and talked about some legislative changes that we need, and one of those areas was within the appeals process. And that process now currently has so many feedback loops and re-entry points that it is almost impossible to get through. And if you look at our current throughput and the backlog that we have, it's about a 5-year process for that appeal to get completed. We got to improve that. But at least now we're recognizing that earlier. We're trying to take a more systems enterprise view, and we understand now what we do in the claims process, the impact that it has on appeals, and working that as one of our 12 breakthrough initiatives. Another is continue to reduce veteran homelessness. I mentioned that a little bit earlier, talking about the issue in LA that opened our eyes a little bit more to strategic partnerships. That's still an issue that we're focusing on. We've made dramatic reduction over the past 3 years. The veteran homeless rate is lower than the non-veteran homeless rate. That was not the case a few years ago. But really until it's zero, our job's not done. Those really focus on the veteran. There are 4 that are more internal focused on how we improve in the way we do business. One is improve our employee experience. And that goes back to if we have empowered employees that are engaged, that'll help us improve our veteran experience. The other 3 really focus, the first on staffing and HR. For those of you in the federal government and those that are working with us, you probably know our HR system sometimes is not the fastest. But we've got to work that. It's incredibly difficult to drive the kind of change that we're after when we have 35% of our leadership positions vacant. It's incredibly hard to drive that. You get people, they're detailed here, they're detailed there, they're there 6 months, 4 months, 60 days, 120 days. So there's been a big push and focus on how do we identify those positions and then really engage with vigor on filling those. And OPM has been a great partner with us on that as well. One is Transform IT. Laverne Council is super. If you haven't had a chance to hear her or be around her, I'd encourage you to do so. She's a hoot. She's a really great person, incredibly smart, and really driving us in a new direction in IT to think more globally about the enterprise. And that's one of the things that Sloan encouraged us to do a lot. We got to think and act like an enterprise. And the last one is transforming the supply chain. That's the one that I wake up more than the others at 4 o'clock in the morning worrying about. Because of our nature of how we were shaped, particularly in the healthcare side, we have about 152 major hospitals scattered across the country. And they really are functioning in a decentralized manner. So we'll have people procuring for those hospitals the same item for each different hospital. Instead of trying to leverage our demand, think about how do we more strategically source that, and how do we deliver that in a way that we don't manage a big inventory at those hospitals. And each one of those hospitals have major clinics, and we have about 900 clinics scattered across the country. So trying to transform that in a way that better leverages our buying power, but at the same time focus on delivering the right supplies to our caregivers at the right price, at the right place. So that's our 12 breakthrough initiatives. As we look to support those from an acquisition and procurement community, there's 5 things that we're focusing on. I'll run through these quickly, and then we'll probably be ready to pause and see if there's any questions. The first is owning our work. I had the opportunity 2 falls ago, so that would be 14, to travel a lot of different facilities in the VA with a team really doing a listening session. The secretary had came in, was hearing a lot of input, felt he wasn't close enough to really what was happening out in the field, and so he charged several of us to head out. And we visited, I think, 20 sites, talked to over 2,000 people, from the night shift that it's doing environmental management, read that janitorial, to the hospital directors, everybody in between, the regional offices as well as memorial affairs. And we talk a lot about, I just mentioned memorial affairs, I just can't resist. You hear a lot about VA, but you don't hear much about the headline that memorial affairs is number 1 or number 2 in the J.D. Powers customer survey in the nation, any industry, anything, for the past 4 or 5 years. Been number 1 more years than number 2. I think this last year or the year before they were number 2. Right? And that's all part of, I think, just how the town is. Right? Bad news grows legs like crazy, and good news seems to just die on the vine. But they do a tremendous job. We went out and we met small groups with employees, and we came back that to a large degree our employees have a sense of learned helplessness. They see themselves as part of this huge bureaucracy that they just don't know how to change, or they just don't believe it can change. And so one of the things that we're doing is encouraging everybody and empowering people to own their work. Look at reports, look at approvals, look at the meetings they go to, the measures, the policies. Which of those are getting in the way of us serving veterans and serving our employees? And that's really a 2 thumbs test that we've started using a lot about owning our work. Is it good for veterans, and is it good for our employees? If it doesn't pass the 2 thumbs test, we need to really be thinking about it, whether that's a policy, and we've had several that we've tossed up to the secretary. It takes longer for us to get the coordination on the memo than it does to get in his office and sign it. I mean, he is about change at the department, and sometimes our own bureaucracy gets in the way of trying to improve our own bureaucracy. I know that sounds kind of crazy, but it's where we are. So owning our work. How do we really own our work and we don't count and rely on 7 layers of review to make sure our work product is right? Let's own our work and let's drive changes to improve the veteran and the employee experience. Another is becoming principle-based instead of so rule-based. And for those of you that were in Williamsburg last fall, Ann Rung mentioned this during her comments. Rules are important, laws are important, regs are important, policies are important, but what's more important is serving veterans. So how do we get to the place where we can do both? How do we get principle-based? I signed out a memo last December listing out our 10 acquisition principles and encouraging initiative, telling people that they are permitted to move out and be innovative. In fact, they're encouraged and in fact expected to move out and do so. We've had some examples, good and bad, in the VA. We had an example in the Northwest last year. A veteran pulls in the parking lot. Okay, great. That was like magic. Thank you. Maybe that was the cue that I need to start wrapping up. They called inside to say, I'm in the parking lot, but I can't get in. My ankle's messed up, and they were told, I can't come out and help you. You have to call 911. Right? Not the right veteran experience. And we all started getting uptight a little bit about the employee, and we found out they were following the rule that the facility had. Several years ago, there was some altercation in the parking lot that went not good, and so they said, hey, for now, we just need to stay in our facility, and we don't need to go out in the parking lot and engage, because you never know what's out there. Things could escalate, so we need to call the proper authorities. So the rule was more important than the principle of serving veterans. We had a case in the Northeast about 4 months ago where a nurse noticed her patient didn't come in, and that's not extremely rare. We have about a 15-20% no-show rate on appointments in some of our facilities. But for her, there was something was not right about that, and she encouraged our security force to engage, and they're like, well, just missing one appointment, we don't engage on that. We wait until this happens before we engage. She kind of nagged him, frankly, and pestered him, and he finally reached out to local law enforcement, and they gave the same answer. Well, you know, people miss appointments, there's no big deal, we're not going to. So she's pestering him, and then he's pestering the local officer. So they went out to the veteran's house finally to do an assistance call. Found him unconscious in the bathroom on the floor. Saved his life. A couple of you may have heard I agree, that's what we want, right? It's about the principle of serving veterans. And I heard the story from Stafford County. Some of you may have heard that a few weeks ago, where a rescue came upon a scene, and there was a young girl that was unconscious and in peril. And the rescue, right, their rules say you don't take people to the hospital, you wait for the ambulance. And they call, the ambulance is on the way, so the rules, wait for the ambulance. Some of you not, so what did they do? They took her to the hospital, right? Saved her life. And what happened to them? They got suspended. They got then reinstated. And everybody went like, whoa, that is just so not right. We're not the only ones in the federal government that have this issue about principles and rules. And I would encourage us all to keep in mind really what the principles are that's driving us to get up in the morning. Let me quickly hit the others. One is we need to do more ordering and less procuring. We're doing so much transactional activity that we don't have the intellectual capacity to really think hard about the items that require a lot of mental acuity. We're so caught in that transactional work. So we need to set up the right vehicles and then have ordering officers, and it become much like an Amazon experience where you pull up what's the approved items that are already ready, set to go, click the button, they're ordered, and they get delivered to you from a supply system. But we're drowning ourselves in transactional activity, and we have to move away from that. We have to better engage with industry. That's one of the tracks here. Another memo I signed out in December is encouraging our folks at the VA to engage more with industry. I heard from you that we weren't engaging. You were told that people couldn't talk to you in the VA. That's not the case. I've got the memos to prove it. And maybe Mary need to send those out if anybody's interested, and ACT-IAC can help get those out. Because it's important that you understand what the expectations are that I have for the folks that are working these issues at the VA. They are expected to engage with you, and that's the kind of behavior that you should be seeing. And the last is we need to collaborate. Acquisition procurement is a team sport. It is not a solo sport. But to collaborate, we need to understand our roles, responsibilities, and not just for us, we need to understand what the whole team is trying to do. Right? If we understand our role a mile deep, but we don't understand what the person upstream and downstream is doing in the process, we're not going to be effective at the end state. And the end state is always focused outside the organization. For us, it's serving veterans and their families and beneficiaries and being good stewards of taxpayers' dollars. Your organization will have kind of a different focus, but I would think it's largely externally. You're trying to provide some service, some good, right? And you're trying to do that as efficiently as you can. I really appreciate the time to come and share. ACT-IAC has been a huge partner for the VA and really across the federal government, but it doesn't happen without people like Mary, Margie, Ted, Jim, Ken, and others that really make it happen. Thank you very much, and Mary, if you like, I'd be happy to take a few questions.
Keisha, do we have microphones for questions? Yep, okay. Questions for Greg?
Got one right here. Yes, sir.
Ken.
How have you supported the cultural change in encouraging people leaning forward in their acquisition roles without getting out of the role set?
Excellent. Good question. So I do realize, I'm sorry, thanks. So the question was, what are we doing to support the cultural change that we're really after across the VA for people to lean forward and take more initiative? I do realize that me signing a memo in December from DC does not change the habits of the 4,000 or 5,000 people that are focused in this business across the VA. I wish it were so, but you're right. It's not just that. It's how do we work to change the culture. And to a degree, part of this is us in leadership getting out from DC and going to the field sites where work is happening. And using some examples like the veteran in the parking lot, like the nurse in the Northeast, like Stafford County, finding real opportunities and listening. I found if you get kind of in small groups with people out in the field and you kind of loosen up and just be a person instead of being a DC bureaucrat, that they'll kind of tell you what's going on and what they need. And I found if you listen, and you'll get quite a list, but if you work one of those and they see that their input made a difference, the gates start opening up. But I found I can't do that by just staying in DC. So I and other the leadership in the VA are really focused on trying to get out and work this at the local level. I don't think this is something we can just do in DC. I thought the memos were important to put the expectations out, but they by themselves are not going to drive the cultural change, and that's, the gentleman was exactly right. That's what we got to have.
Great. It's great to hear from you from a non-IT person, and you're working on to improve the lot. But overall, from a non-IT perspective, what do you see the role of IT in all this
So one of those is transforming IT, and there are structural changes that we're doing as well. And IT really permeates most of those 12 as an enabling factor, whether it's access to care and how do we improve our scheduling system, which is an IT issue, whether it's the appeals process and how do we take the information from one IT system that's in VBA, our Veteran Benefits Administration, and make that available to the Board of Veterans Appeals. All through those, IT is woven in there. And one of the things that Laverne is really focusing on is how do we best understand that requirement, the business requirement that then drives the IT requirement. One of my 10 principles is good requirements make good contracts. And I think to a degree, the procurement community has put this kind of cloud of mystery and mystique over the procurement process. That's not where the magic happens. The magic happens in the requirements part, the thinking about the alternative analysis and the options and how to lay out really what's the outcome that's intended. That's hard. And articulating that in a way that we can engage with industry and have a meaningful discussion and offer and propose is incredibly important. The acquisition procurement process, good requirements is the key to that. And Laverne is really helping to drive the IT organization to best understand the business needs driven through those 12, to understand then how does IT enable that. Yes.
Any other questions for Greg? Yes. Any legal or regulatory changes you would like to see that would make your job easier?
This may be no. I think we've met the enemy, and it's us. I really do. I think if you, and Tiffany Hickson's sitting at your table, who is a master at doing this, of looking at the FAR and all the regs and finding out how to get to yes, finding out how to get things done. And that, to me, is what we've got to work on. It's the culture of using those and then finding the way forward. Right? In a bureaucracy, it's child's play to get nothing done. Right? That's a piece of cake. You can do nothing, you'll not even break a sweat, and stuff won't happen. Right? The hard part is maneuvering through that, finding the way forward, getting to yes. Right? And I think the yeses are out there, and we could spend, I think, a lot of time trying to convince the Hill to do some legislation. And at some time we may need that, but I think right now we need to demonstrate that we have the ability to improve with what we have before we go make that case.
Yes?
Hey, Tim.
Connection between supply chain and category management?
Yes, there is. It's good to see Joni here and Jeff. Good to see them. We've been, I believe, good partners with OFPP on category management. We're co-leading with DoD and HHS on some medical-related category management items. And I look at what we're trying to do at the VA in terms of really leverage our spend and understand how to be more strategic about our requirements. That really OFPP is trying to do that writ large for the government. And as hard as it is for us at the VA to do that, I can't imagine how difficult it is for them to do that, and we want to be and continue to be a willing partner with that. But it is a key, and we have some of our senior staff focused on that as well.
We're focused on rules-based training. What advice do you have for young people or people getting started in to change how we do the jobs better?
So the question was, what advice would I have to young people about if we're trying to do this shift from rules-based, how to do their job better? So one would be not to interpret what I'm saying as rules aren't important. Right? They're a framework, they're things that help us standardize work, but really understand what they are. I've found many times that what we think was the rule was the water cooler myth. And it wasn't really the rule, it wasn't the policy at all. So really be technically competent in your field, but understand the role that plays. Understand what the organization is trying to do. Understand what your customer is trying to do. And a lot of times I think we don't view our internal customer as a real customer. You know, they'll call us and we're like, why are you bothering me? All right? What would you do if you were to call in your personal life, if you were to call somebody and they treated you that way as a customer? Right? I was going to say Yellow Pages, but nobody uses that anymore. You get your phone out, right, and you'd find somebody else. Right? We need to establish that as well, but it starts with being technically competent in your field, and then understanding what's really the principle, what's the outcome, what's the organization really trying to accomplish, and then make that successful as part of the team.
Thank you. All right.
Mary, thank you very much.
Greg, thank you so much.
Well, thank you to my friend Greg. Please give him another round of applause for those great remarks. It's now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, and this is a great honor. When we talk about keeping our nation strong and secure, both here and abroad, I can't think of anybody who has done so from an acquisition perspective and a senior leadership perspective more than this next person. Claire Grady assumed the position of the Director of Defense Procurement and Acquisition Policy, meaning the DPAP for those you all know, last year. She serves as the principal advisor to the Undersecretary for AT&L Acquisition Technology and Logistics and to the Defense Acquisition Board on all acquisition and procurement strategies for all major weapon systems, major automated information systems, and all parts of defense procurement and acquisition policy. She's the leader for all defense services acquisition. She's responsible for domestic, international, and contingency contract policy for DoD, which includes all competition, source selection, multi-year contracting, leasing, and all other associated e-business solutions. Before this, she was the Coast Guard's Deputy Assistant Commandant for Acquisition and Director of Acquisition Services. She served as the Coast Guard's HCA from 2007 to 2013, where she led all operations, procurement policy, and operations for all of the different missions of the Coast Guard. She's also served as Director of Strategic Initiatives in the Office of the Chief Procurement Officer for the Department of Homeland Security, providing oversight over all the multi-billion-dollar things that DHS does. Again, from a national security and homeland security perspective, I don't know of anybody who has done the kinds of things that Claire has done in her career to keep our country safe and secure. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Claire Grady.
Thank you so much, Jim. Those are really kind words. It's a pleasure to see everybody this morning. I'm always reminded as to just how small the acquisition world really is, which is a wonderful thing. So it's a pleasure to see some people I hadn't seen in a little while. And Jeff Kosus, who I probably see a little too often. But really appreciate the opportunity to come speak with y'all this morning. There's a lot going on in the procurement world, in the acquisition world, and across Department of Defense. DoD, as y'all probably know, accounts for about 65% of the government spend. So we're talking about a fairly substantial chunk of money. Last year, $274 billion. Of that $274 billion, 154-ish billion was spent on services. Really excited to see that that is one of the tracks that are going to be addressed today, and a continued area of emphasis. To me, that's an area that has been significantly under scrutinized is the wrong word, underappreciated and undermanaged. With $154 billion, you'd think that it would have attracted a lot more attention a lot sooner. It has not, but we're catching up, and we're catching up fast, in a great part due to the leadership of Ken Brennan, who's here today, and he will be speaking later, as well as collaboration across with the OFPP and category managers and category leaders who are also present today. Within DoD, we drag major acquisition programs through a knothole. The lovely 5000 series, which, as much as we try and rationalize, that is a very complex series of steps and processes intended to make sure we field assets that are going to keep our nation state safe. You're talking about, in many cases, really pushing the technological envelope, and by necessity, there are very disciplined system engineering requirements, processes associated with those. Yet for services, we just give people money and hope for the best. And that has historically been largely the approach. That's not a good way of proceeding. That is a lot of money that gets invested that we need the outcomes to be achieved through those services. And it all starts, as Greg mentioned, with requirements. Do we have the right requirements up front? And quite frankly, what I saw a lot of, not just here, but other places, is people wanting to buy what we bought last time. Well, guess what? What we buy now shouldn't be the same thing we bought last time. Maybe it works, maybe it didn't, but even if it worked perfectly, how has the environment changed? How has the industry changed? How has our requirement changed? Are we really looking at it and thinking through what it is we're going to procure? And are we talking to industry to make sure that we're communicating that effectively? I'm really encouraged by a lot of the work that has happened, and I can speak very proudly about a lot of this because I stepped in right about the time the DoD instruction was about to be signed. So this is not me taking credit for my brilliant thinking. This is giving credit where credit is due for the thought processes that went into how DoD is going to manage services going forward. There is a strong emphasis at the front end to look across all of our requirements and say, do we have it right? Are we spending our dollars on the top priority? And I'm not going to say we wasted dollars, because we didn't, but was there some duplication? Were there some opportunities to be a smarter consumer? Did we go through and look correctly and do the right reviews up front to make sure that the highest priority requirements were getting funded? So now we have a process called the SRRBs. We also look from a portfolio perspective and say, can we look across how we buy some of these services, what our requirements are, and manage those more effectively as a portfolio? So we have the functional domain experts who look from a portfolio perspective. And then we also have senior service managers at each of our major activities or agencies who look and say, how do we buy services for that agency? I'm not going to go into a lot more detail about what we're doing from a services perspective because I know that'll be a subject of discussion later, but there really is an effort to say we need to be smarter about how we manage those requirements, how we identify those requirements, how we communicate with industry, and how we manage them all the way through execution. One of our challenges associated with that is a lot of the folks involved in acquisition of services don't consider themselves acquirers, don't consider themselves acquisition professionals. Acquisition is far bigger than just, are you a program manager, are you a logistician? It's from requirements all the way through closeout. And so we're trying to kind of change that perception. But we have a bunch of individuals who have requirements, who have service needs, who aren't sitting in acquisition billets. So how do we reach out to them and get them engaged in the process and get them identifying what their roles and responsibilities are and make sure we provide them training in time to do that smartly, instead of, again, just saying, good luck, you have a requirement. We can do better than that, and we are working on doing much better than that. So a lot going on in services, a lot of emphasis associated with how are we going to be better consumers of services, a lot of emphasis on industry engagement. We need to understand the market forces instead of just assuming we know how those markets work. And I think one of the strengths of the approach is just because services is in the title doesn't mean it's all one and the same. There's a big difference between an R&D service, a construction service, a medical service, an audit service. Just because they have services in the title does not mean they're exactly the same thing, and we really need to be smarter than that. So we really are making a tremendous amount of progress, and it's an area where I think we have an opportunity to make sure we're ensuring better outcomes associated with those dollars that we're investing. Another area that we're really emphasizing, which you guys are talking about today, is cyber. Our technological superiority is at risk. It's a fact. One of the statements that I love is there are two types of companies, those of them who have been breached and those who don't know they've been breached. But they've all been breached. And we find it's a very large organization. There are vulnerabilities. We are very reliant on our supply chain. We are very reliant on companies we do business with for our future success. Associated with that, it is important to safeguard that intellectual property. A lot of the companies we do business with recognize that and realize just how critical that is for their future success as well as our national security. So, but it takes time to say what should be the cybersecurity posture associated with how do we invoke it. And this last summer, I made the very unpopular decision in concert with the CIO to implement an interim rule relative to cybersecurity. There's a lot of goodness associated with that, and quite frankly, according to our technical experts, not that big of a step forward from where we already were, but invoking the newness standard caught some people by surprise perhaps, and the flow down through the supply chain took more time than perhaps we had anticipated. So we worked through with industry based on good feedback and said, okay, it's effective immediately, but you have time to phase in and meet your requirements, but come in and tell our CIO where you are relative to meeting all of those requirements and your plan to get there. So I think we came up with a reasonable compromise associated with, we knew we needed to move in that direction. Just hoping everybody would do it on their own wasn't going to work. And quite frankly, one of the biggest concerns I had was I saw proliferation of individual offices going out and writing their own cybersecurity clauses. The only thing worse than me telling everybody they had to implement this new rule quickly was telling all of industry they had to implement 23, 47, or whatever the number would be, different cyber standards and try and meet those. So don't take implementing an interim rule lightly, but in this case, we really saw a very big vulnerability, needed to take action, and I know some other agencies, Homeland Security and others, have similarly attempted to address the cyber challenge, and we will continue to work from a federal government perspective to try and get to the common NIST standard and implement consistently so that people don't try and have to meet differing standards. But in the case of defense, we couldn't wait. We needed to take action to preserve that. And it was truly a national security imperative from our perspective. Speaking of national security imperatives, innovation. Innovation is absolutely critical. Like I said, I was really happy when I saw all your themes, because there are several things that we've been emphasizing heavily. DoD has been incredibly active across the board in different ways associated with it, trying to embrace innovation and trying to make the cultural change that Greg was talking about this morning, in terms of people willing to take risks, prudent risks, after assessing the outcomes. And we're pushing in a bunch of different directions, both in terms of small steps, big steps, and visual steps, as well as just some different changes in policy. I don't know how much you all follow, but Dr. Carter has now made 3 trips out to Silicon Valley. It's kind of interesting to think that the Secretary of Defense had not been out to Silicon Valley in over 20 years. That's a pretty big source of technology, pretty big source of innovation, and to not be plugged in to that kind of innovation was perhaps a mistake, and something we want to make sure that we're open to. Because one of the challenges we all face, and from an acquisition perspective, is it is a very cumbersome bureaucracy associated with our procurement and acquisition systems. As much as we try and streamline and try and improve and enhance and be less bureaucratic, there are a number of things that have built up over time that can be daunting for people who are not familiar with working with the federal government. We don't want to close ourselves off to opportunities for new technology, new companies who have not traditionally dealt with Department of Defense or other federal agencies to come in and want to do business with us. And we are not the easiest customer. When we look at everything we require, everything that we do, it can be challenging for companies. So what we're trying to look at and say, are there different ways where we can kind of start to bridge that gap? And when I say bridge that gap, I'm not talking about making it easier just for companies that have not traditionally done business with us, but how do we make it easier for companies that already do business with us? Are there smarter ways we can proceed? Are we challenging the right regulations and trying to remove roadblocks or barriers associated with doing business with us? So one of the areas that we're emphasizing out of my office is we have a whole range of procurement vehicles and tools available, called BAAs, broad agency announcements, CRADAs, other transactions. There are a whole bunch of different tools, but what I tend to find is sometimes the easiest answer is to default to what somebody knows best. If you do FAR Part 15, sole source negotiation procurements, everything looks the same, and you try and apply those same skill sets. So one of the things we're working on is trying to provide job tools and job aids to help people be more aware of and more comfortable with using different contract types, looking at what the circumstances are and tailoring accordingly. And when I say contract types, not just the different versions I talked about, but are we force-fitting stuff into firm fixed price that shouldn't be? Are we using cost-type contracts appropriately for development-type efforts? Are we looking across the board to make sure the contract terms and conditions really match the business arrangement and will lead to the outcomes we're desiring? So I should have on my desk this week, I really hope, the contract type selection guide and incentive guidebook. So we'll be signing that out. I'm going to say this week, Ken's laughing. I'm going to say this week, it's not like the DoD instruction, which it's beyond our control to get through all of the wickets. I should sign that out this week. But really the goal is, and this is an extension of Frank Kendall's Better Buying Power, are we encouraging people to do the critical thinking? Are we incentivizing the right outcomes? Are we focused and understand what outcomes we're trying to achieve? And are we looking at the data necessary to make the right decisions? So there's a lot going on from that perspective. But getting back to innovation, so we have our Defense Innovative Unit Experimental, DIUX, out in Silicon Valley. And by choice, that office does not have any procurement authority. And it may sound weird if we were going to establish an office out in the Silicon Valley. Why don't they have dollars? Why don't they have procurements? Well, the reason they don't have dollars or procurements is because we want them connecting, matchmaking, Match.com, call it whatever you want, between individuals with ideas, with end users with requirements. We don't want to just throw money at it and say, look, it's successful because we obligated money. We actually want to get money flowing towards a true legitimate need that will result in something we can ultimately field. In some cases, we won't be successful. We may invest in some technology that doesn't pan out, but that's okay. I think we're trying to embrace the Silicon Valley mantra, which is not just fail fast, it's fail fast so you can get to success. And that's the get to success piece that we're really focused on. So we're looking across the board and saying, how do we make that happen? How do we take advantage of that presence? How do we communicate on complex subjects like intellectual property? And this audience, probably more than any, appreciates just how complicated the intellectual property framework is within certain of our federal contracts. Other transactions provide some additional flexibility, but they have to be used prudently to make sure that we really do get the right information and the right data rights associated with those. So a lot of tools, but it gets back to using the right tool for the particular endeavor. We are trying to embrace change. It takes time. The new phrase that Dr. Carter's using is think outside the five-sided box. The Pentagon is a particular view of the world. It is not the only view of the world. And how do we stay plugged in? And circling back to my original comment, we really need to take advantage of emerging technologies. We in DoD keep things far longer than anybody would in terms of 30, 40 years for some of these major weapon systems. How do we keep them current, relevant, and moving forward so that we really can meet emerging threats? And there are emerging threats across the country, across the world. It is really a dangerous, dangerous place. Greg highlighted some of and Jim, unfortunately, the attacks that occurred this morning in Brussels. We have troops in Iraq, we have troops in Afghanistan, we have troops in a number of places, as does Department of Homeland Security and other people. They're fighting a number of threats, and the threats evolve. So how do we make sure that we can keep up with those threats? So really trying to emphasize aspects of adaptability and agility, things like modularity, plug and play different upgrades. How do we make things so that we can evolve as the threat evolves? How can we be responsive to that threat cycle when our procurement process and our budget process works on a 5-year defense plan? How do we work within that? So we've engaged a lot with the Hill and looked at our own internal processes to make sure that we are not creating impediments ourselves. Looking hard at that, we got a lot of different authorities in last year's National Defense Authorization Act that we're working on in terms of prototype authorities, pilot authorities, and the Hill is very interested in continuing to help us this year. In some cases, not necessarily all the help we want, but they are interested in making sure that we are moving forward. So throughout that language, there is a lot of emphasis on commercial technology. And the commercial technology is not just commercial in and of itself. It is the accessibility to those markets that we may not have traditionally tapped into. So when you look at commercial, it's not just okay, I can go down to Target and buy this. It's, okay, it's a product that will be available for commercial sale, but if we adapted it, could we use it in a defense environment? Are we taking full advantage of where the commercial world is going? And related to that, are we being smart about how we're dealing with that industrial base to make sure that we are people that they want to do business with? So looking hard at trying to change that mentality of going back to you do what you know, that we aren't going to get certified cost or pricing data associated with that. We're going to get to a fair price, but we're going to use different means than how we may have traditionally approached things. So when you buy something commercially, you don't say, what did it cost to build that gadget? What you think from a value base, what is it worth it to you to buy that? That's a different kind of construct than what we have all historically, or those of us who've been around for a while, historically grown up with in terms of how we approach pricing from a federal government perspective. But it's something we have no problem doing in our private lives. When you buy a house, do you say, how many bricks are in there? How many man hours did it take to build it? What's the price per square foot of carpet that they paid, depreciated? No. You look at it and say, okay, what's the market price? What is the cost per square foot? You may look at some high-level metrics. You look at comparables and do some sort of an adjustment. I don't have a TV, I don't have a chimney or a fireplace, I do have a pool. I have an extra bedroom, but less bathrooms. There are different ways of looking at things that we perhaps have not traditionally done when we've looked at how do we price things. And I think that's an area where we really need to grow in terms of understanding different ways of approaching that. And what I see my job as doing is helping equip my workforce with those tools to help look differently. It's going to be different not just for us, though, it's also going to be different for industry. If we're dealing with some of our more traditional contractors, they're used to how do you price in a traditional methodology. So one of the things that we're doing as part of the industry engagement associated with this initiative is reaching out to some of our larger contractors who have commercial products that we continue to buy and say, okay, what information do you have that supports the price you want to charge us? What information should you routinely provide associated with that? And this isn't trying to say, okay, how do we replicate what we always traditionally get, just call it something different. This is more, when you're dealing with your commercial customers, what is the information you would typically provide? How can we assure ourselves that we're getting to a fair price associated with a commercial product without having to resort to the cost or pricing data or other than cost or pricing data? So we really want to look at different ways of approaching that challenge. And the intent is not to put the burden on industry, but if they have information that they routinely provide to support pricing, we want to know what that is so that we can work through with them to get to fair prices without having to default to what we know. And I really appreciate that in the Authorization Act language last year, they still provided that after you exhaust these other mechanisms, you can still get cost or pricing data. But that shouldn't be our default position. That should be our last resort position, because everybody is interested in making sure that we are getting a fair and reasonable price for taxpayer dollars. Because as much as we want to deal with commercial companies, we are not spending our own money. Private industry has different metrics and different risk tolerance associated with that. And that's perfectly appropriate. They have that ultimate profit outcome, and a company will not survive if they don't make good decisions about how they do things, particularly something as strategically important as procurement. But within the federal government, we have a little bit of different challenge in that we have scrutiny and oversight, and it's natural and appropriate. We have a system of checks and balances, and there are people who will, after the fact, look at things. That's part of our process. That's one of the things that helps make the whole system of our government work. But how do I provide guidance to those contracting officers so when somebody comes in and asks, why is that reasonable? There is documentation to support it and policy to show that what they did was consistent with what our intent was. I don't want the IG coming in and blaming a GS9 buyer who worked really hard to buy a part that is keeping an aircraft flying. I want them coming in and blaming my policy and asking me why I told them it was okay to do that, rather than picking on somebody. So I want to train our workforce. I want to put the policy out. We want to work with industry relative to what information they're going to provide to us. And those collectively, I think, are going to help us move forward in terms of commercial procurement. Big area of emphasis, big challenge, both from some really old stuff we keep flying, C-130s, been around forever. Some of those parts were once had a thriving commercial marketplace. Now we're pretty much it in some cases. So how do you come to what's a fair price there? All the way to the other end of, we have a product that nobody has ever sold before. There isn't an established market price. How do we figure out what to pay for that? So we're really trying to look at that whole spectrum of challenges associated with commercial pricing. And well, like the VA, we have 10 different principles that we are embracing associated with continuation of better buying power. There are very, very well thought through principles available online. I won't walk you through every one of them, but one of the things I did want to emphasize is my personal favorite, which is our people can never be too professional or too competent, and they are the most important part of the process. To me, that is the paramount principle. and really where we need to go and continue to go. We've been very fortunate that the Hill has supported our acquisition workforce, and we've been able to grow and invest in and train that workforce. Where I am emphasizing going forward is continuing beyond just the basic certification levels. What can we do to help enhance their skill sets? We're asking them to take on new challenges. We're not going to ask them to do that without policy or training. So how do we follow through associated with that from a continuous training perspective? And while we've always had a requirement for continuous training, it has in some cases become a little bit of a check the box in terms of 80 hours every 2 years. We want people to really give thought to how they're training and what their skill gaps might be to keep pace with technology, to keep pace with what we're asking them to do. You'll hear Ann Rung talk later today about innovation and the innovation labs and agility, and I'm sure you all will talk all day about these sorts of things. But how do we keep pace from a procurement perspective with those trends so that we make sure that we're an ally, not an obstacle to proceeding with that? So I really wanted to make sure I'm equipping our workforce going forward. I have 30,000 procurement professionals across the Department of Defense. They are all doing wonderful things. You may read about an occasional procurement that went awry or a problem that was encountered that could have been handled differently. That is absolutely the exception, not the rule. You're going to recognize award winners like the fine gentleman from the Air Force over here who have done amazing things from an acquisition perspective. But quite frankly, most acquisition professionals consider doing amazing things their job description. They get things done, they make it happen, they make sure they support the mission, they're absolutely focused on the right things and the right outcomes, and they do it in a way where we spend taxpayer dollars efficiently and effectively. Those are not what you read about. You read about when something went wrong, when somebody used a purchase card to buy something they shouldn't have, when a acquisition didn't plan out quite the way it should have. Those are what get headlines. It's not the success stories. And I never want to lose sight of that when we look at our acquisition workforce and how we're proceeding. So a lot of different moving parts, a lot of different things that we're working on in terms of trying to move things forward. I didn't touch on some of the things we're working on relative to source selection, which is another better communication with industry, where we're looking at, can we describe up front what that value trade-off is going to be? If we can get to the end and determine best value, wouldn't it be nice if we could communicate up front how much more some capability or capacity was worth to us? We've seen that play out in a few source selections already, some of the major systems. For example, Joint Light Tactical Vehicle. We communicated up front how much more we were willing to pay for increased availability. If you tell people what it is you want and how much it's worth it to you, and when I say worth it to you, it's the end user it's worth it to, not the contracting officer, not the program manager. It sure helps industry figure out how and where they want to invest in terms of their proposal to respond to that requirement. And wouldn't it be nice if we didn't make people guess what was really important to us or how important it was to us? So that's one of the tenets you'll see coming out in the source selection guidebook. I could talk pretty much all day about everything we have going on, particularly from a procurement perspective. It's a busy time frame. We have not only a whole lot of the NDAA language, we're also following through on better buying power to make sure it's sustained from a regulation perspective. We also are working hard with OFPP and others to implement some of the executive orders. It's pretty crazy, but a lot of great things are happening across the workforce and across the community. And I know I'm speaking primarily to defense, but there are really just great innovative things that are happening. And one of my frustrations is, how do we get that out? How do we advertise it? Greg had a great response earlier. It's not about writing a memo, which is absolutely true. But it kills me sometimes when I talk to somebody who's doing something absolutely wonderful, and I say, well, why don't you tell people about this? Well, if somebody finds out, they might make me stop. And I'm like, oh, that is just not the mentality we want. So how do we share those successes? How do we build on those successes? How do we get those across the community? Because there really are some just fantastic things that are happening, and they're just happening in pockets, and then people go on and do their next job, and we're not taking advantage of those lessons learned and processes going forward. The innovation labs should help. I know that there are award programs that recognize absolutely stellar performance, but there are great things happening every day. How do we tap into those? How do we capture those? How do we cross-pollinate those across agencies, within agencies, to make sure we're taking full advantage of those? So that, to me, is one of the areas that I really want to emphasize in terms of taking advantage of those and building them into tools that other people can use, not just pockets of excellence. So those were the larger things that we're working on, and I have lists of other things, but I would much rather speak with you all about what it is that interests you and what you're focused on, and any questions you might have associated with the various initiatives we have going on. Yes?
So, thank you for your comments. You touched on a lot of issues at a high level that I think this group is interested in. I can tell you from the vendor community, particularly in IT, that a really core and fundamental issue, we touched on it a number of times, is LPTA versus best value. There's a sense that as much as you'd like to do more best value type procurements and get more, longer term life cycles, more innovation and everything, that the skill sets, the ability to generate the requirements and to fairly evaluate best value awards, it's not really there, so the fallback position is LPTA. So how do you migrate, and it's hinted at a lot in the better buying power initiatives, but how do you really migrate an acquisition community that defaults to LPTA because that's what they know how to do, that's where the skill sets are, when you really do need to go into more of a best value approach to drive things like cyber and other areas?
So the challenge associated with low price, technically acceptable source selections has been potentially overused across the federal government and not used appropriately in certain circumstances. GAO did do a study associated with DoD's use of LPTA and determined when LPTA was used, it was largely used correctly. That was a small sample associated with an audit. So within the Department of Defense, Frank Kendall signed out a memo, which I think very smartly and succinctly captures when LPTA is appropriate. The goal there was to upfront say, LPTA is one tool, used appropriately in these limited circumstances, it's appropriate. Other than those limited circumstances, you should not be looking to LPTA. And LPTA, it's when price is the predominant factor, when you can define your requirements and the technical levels sufficiently so that they're clearly understood. And one of the important parts, when you're not willing and there is no value associated with paying for any higher performance. So when you look at those different criteria that were laid out, and it's on March 14, 2015 memo that I think really succinctly address that challenge. Are we going to continue to see occasions when LPTA is perhaps not used correctly? Yes. But what we're doing is working through our senior acquisition, meaning program management, and contracting leadership about the appropriate use and correcting where we see the use is not appropriate. But the emphasis is understanding when you use it and laying out the specific criteria associated with when it might be appropriate so that you lead people to the right conclusion associated with it. If we just signed out a memo that said LPTA is bad, don't use it, well, in some limited circumstances, LPTA is appropriate. Commodity type material where you can define your technical qualifications so that there is no question and you're not willing to pay for anything more, okay, that's appropriate. But that is going to be in very limited circumstances and not frequently when you're actually ordering professional services, for example, or other aspects of goods or services. So we're tackling it both from a policy and then also a feedback mechanism. And I'm not going to stand in front of you and tell you it doesn't happen. I had a conversation over the holidays with a company who, with a contracting office, who I won't name, who literally was buying executive coaching services on LPTA. We had a little mentoring session, and that solicitation was canceled. But more importantly, we talked through the principles behind why it wasn't appropriate, so that next time when they're approaching a source selection, they'll feel more comfortable. The source selection guidebook that we're about to issue also reemphasizes that, and we're working with DAU through the training. So we're tackling it from a couple different aspects. LPTA is one tool. It is, quite frankly, and Dominic Sapiccio was in my office a few months ago telling me LPTA gets protested just as much as best value, and I'm sure he's right, because Dominic wouldn't have said it if it wasn't. But we want to make sure that we're using the right tool for the job, and are we going to get the right outcome? And LPTA is not going to lead to the right outcome unless it meets those very narrow criteria.
So, to follow up on that, the use of LPTA does have some benefits as far as the easier content file processing for your staff. How do you balance that with, the budgetary pressure, the drawdown, community in general? If you move towards this value, how are you going to deal with that and the different services and agencies that all of that
So related to that is the emphasis on the outcomes and the data associated with demonstrating the outcomes. There's going to be pressure on workforces. It doesn't take a genius to look at the budgetary environment and say there's going to be fiscal pressure and pressure to constrain expenditures across the board, and we're going to have to work through that. What we're trying to keep the emphasis on, though, is if I engage on an LPTA where it's not appropriate, I'm going to spend money, resources, conduct the procurement, and not get what I need, or not sufficiently address the need. So trying to emphasize that connection with the mission and the outcomes when people are working through that process. We also look at different metrics associated with our contracting workforce to look for, in a lot of these cases, they're lagging indicators, but you look at things like halts that are getting longer or undefinitized contract actions to look at potential symptoms of an unhealthy workforce. Also work with each of the services, the Army, Navy, Air Force, as well as the Fourth Estate, associated with their forecasting. And while I don't own all those billets, I am very passionate about making sure that we have those right billets, and the senior acquisition executives across those services really value what the procurement professionals do. So while we have the pressure to go down in terms of manpower, it has not been as great on the contracting workforce, which I think is a tremendous vote of respect for what they're doing for the organization and how critical they are for what we achieve. So we're always going to have to watch that and watch those pressures. But right now we're doing well, and with the strength from all the way down from the secretary, people are supporting making sure that we are adequately resourcing that. We could not survive and do what we do in the Department of Defense, and no federal agency could, without contracting, buying goods and services to make that happen. And the fact that it's viewed not as transactionally, but as a strategic partner for achieving those outcomes really helps make the value proposition associated with why we shouldn't be cutting resources. But it's always going to be something to watch for, and I think it's a shortcut that results in bad outcomes. And so that's the message we're going to keep emphasizing with LPTA when it's used, when it's not appropriate. Yes?
In terms of acquisition costs, what is being done to make sure that cost overruns on all types of procurements are minimized? Because as a taxpayer, that's the thing that bothers me the most, is when, it's advertised at one price and at the end of it, it's 2, 3, 4 times what was initially planned.
So from an acquisition perspective, in terms of avoiding acquisition overruns, and there are some horrific examples that I'm sure everybody could think of. Outside of Frank Kendall's office is "In God We Trust, All Others Bring Data" is literally the sign outside of his office. He is absolutely committed to, as is the entire department, associated with getting the cost estimates done right up front, not deluding ourselves into believing that we can buy more than what the estimates indicate. And looking up front associated with our requirements to say, and the initiative is called Bending the Cost Curve, where you really understand what your cost drivers are, what's going to drive that final, not just unit cost, acquisition unit cost, but also your sustainment costs. So doing that analysis up front before we choose to invest in and proceed with a major acquisition. So I'll give a horrible example, and we didn't do this, so I'll say it was the Coast Guard, but I was dealing with a requirements officer from, we're buying a new ship, and he wanted the ship to cost less. So he said, can't we use a lower escalation rate? Well, yeah, we can, but that does not take any actual cost out of the ship. It just makes it artificially look cheaper. So we're working heavily with CAPE and from an acquisition perspective and the service cost positions to make sure that we're really informed up front, that we know what it's going to cost. And what's been great about all the initiatives associated with better buying power is the data shows the unit cost increases, the schedule delays, both in development and production, have really, really significantly tightened. They're the best that they've ever been from a defense acquisition perspective. And I think a lot of that comes from getting the requirements right up front, doing the good cost estimating, and then not recognizing with that bending the cost curve that maybe you want a little bit more, but if it's going to cost infinitely more money and you're not ever going to be able to achieve it, maybe you relook at your requirements and look at achieving them a different way. But there is the discipline across the system to try and preclude circumstances when you go forward. And obviously there are checks and balances in the system associated with if you exceed a certain threshold, the secretary has to reaffirm the need for that particular equipment, et cetera. But that's after the fact. Where you can really think about and intelligently make choices is on the front end of a program. And that's really what better buying power is. While procurement is a large part of it, better buying power is so much bigger and starts with the requirements and understanding what those requirements drive from a cost perspective.
Claire, I have a question. Do you mind?
Sure, not at all.
As you talked about, the ideal of getting requirements up front, but as you're moving to more services and moving to more agile, incremental development where you're essentially developing the requirements as you're developing the solution, what are the challenges that imposes on your acquisition people where they're used to having a requirement up front?
Well, part of it is when we say the requirements, it's high level the requirements of what is the outcome you're looking to achieve, and then figuring out, okay, how do you achieve it? So one of the things that we're looking heavily at is modularity, plug and play. Maybe we don't have the full capability to do everything we need for the next 30 or 40 years with that asset now. But how do we define the interfaces and make sure that we control those so that in the future we can put in that additional capability as that capability evolves and develops? It would be very naive to say that we would know what we need for the next 30, 40, 50 years now. Yet we keep these assets for at least that long. I think one of the oldest ships in the Navy right now is 57, 58 years. And think about that. A lot of people in my workforce weren't even born then. And so when we're buying these are assets that our children and grandchildren are going to serve on. That's a pretty big concept. So looking at the ability to plug and play and do block upgrades and try and avoid that vendor lock up front so that we have that flexibility so we can take advantage of however things evolve, and not try and think about how do we capture the requirements for 50 years. It's how do we capture requirements for now, for an immediate threat that can then grow with and upgrade to the additional threat as it emerges. So we're really trying to not say we can solve everything now, it's how do we continue to allow ourselves to get smarter as we move forward.
Remember in school of thought that says to make the process more efficient and to keep the cost under control. Let the industry know your budget number. What do you think for that?
So the question was to better inform industry, should we make budget numbers available associated with future acquisition and upgrades? I will say that there is tremendous visibility within the budget already. An example I'll give is I bought a new class of an amphibious assault transport dock ship when I was working for the Navy. That is a line item in the budget. And that program is a line item in the budget. And after the fact, after we had gone through the protests with industry, and I was talking to one of the bid capture managers associated with that, they told me how much they had spent on a consultant to dissect the numbers to know exactly how much we had to make that contract award. And there is a lot of information that is readily available, and I do think that there's opportunities both from a should cost perspective and a design to cost perspective to make better transparency associated with those numbers. But at the major program level, there's a lot of insight already published in our budget documents going forward. Can we do better and help engage industry with those trade-offs? Absolutely. So that's an area that we're really looking at, and we're also looking at challenging our program managers and our whole acquisition team to look at things a little bit differently and say, okay, just because I have enough money in the budget doesn't mean I need to spend all of it on that if I can get that cheaper and more efficiently and without compromising. So what we're looking at is should cost initiatives. So we challenge every program manager to say, okay, what are you going to focus on from an acquisition and a life cycle cost to try and drive down those costs? And in cases where vendors have already been selected, vendors are absolutely completely engaged in that. What I think we need to do, though, is translate that a little bit more earlier in the program when we have that industry engagement where industry has some great input in terms of how do we drive down the costs. And an example I'll give is over at the Coast Guard with the offshore patrol cutter. When we were driving through those requirements, huge emphasis on affordability. We got some phenomenal input from not just our shipbuilders, but some of the vendors of things where we were driving costs in that we didn't realize. In some cases, we absolutely needed it because we needed redundant capability because that ship was going into harm's way. We couldn't go with the commercial alternative. In other cases, we didn't realize that we were driving costs in because of how we had specified things. And that feedback helped us drive down the cost of that ship about 15%, which is just tremendous. But we didn't get there by having an industry day where somebody stood in front of an auditorium and talked at the audience and didn't listen to what the knowledgeable people had to say. They got there through sitting down one-on-one with different industry elements, different vendors, to get that feedback and taking it seriously, instead of just, no, we know what we want, which sometimes happens, and I don't think it's because people are cavalier. I think people are just so anxious to move out on an urgent requirement that we don't necessarily build in enough time up front to think through implications of some of the decisions we're making.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks, Mary. Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate it. Grabbing my soda.
Thank you, Claire. I don't know about you guys, but between Greg's remarks and Claire's remarks, I mean, you can just hear the passion for the mission, the focus on trying to, really think about the most important things for not only the workforce, but, for serving government, protecting our nation, serving our veterans, the innovation theme that's just prevalent. Just great leaders in great positions, and we've been really lucky to hear from both Claire and Greg this morning. So let's give them another round of applause. And Claire, I really appreciated all the plugs for the sessions, the services acquisition, the innovation and acquisition. You talked about the Silicon Valley focus, and that's going to be a lot of what our afternoon session, the last closing panel, will talk about the government industry relationships, what's important to each other to make those things work, and how we are trying to work with the emerging technology community in a very different way. And both DHS and DoD have recently opened offices out on the West Coast to really focus on that and try to inject this government with some new thinking and some new technology. Okay, so before we break for our time in the exhibitor hall, and we are there yet, we'll go over the agenda really quickly. We've got 4 track sessions this morning. And we also have the sessions from the digital government mini sessions, which I mentioned earlier. So this morning we have government initiatives for improving services acquisition. Ken Brennan, thank you very much. The problem with the problem statement, how to create a cybersecurity resilient organization throughout acquisition changes, and the value of supplier relationship management. All the government digital mini sessions are listed in your program books and your mobile app if you haven't downloaded that yet. And of course, there's signage posted outside of each of these rooms. We've got a whole host of speakers from several different agencies this morning, including GSA, the SEC, DHS, VA, EPA, National Labor Relations Board, and so you're just going to hear, we've got over 35 agencies represented at this event today, so we are just in really good shape with that. Jim.
As you can see, these are pretty tough choices, and I don't think we could have asked for a better setup than what Greg and Claire have done in terms of positioning you to attend one of these. You really can't make a wrong choice, and I want to congratulate the track chairs and their volunteers for the great work they've done putting together these sessions, both in the morning and the afternoon. So before you go, Mary also mentioned the mobile app. If you don't already have it, please go to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store and look for that app and download it. You can follow all of the conversations, the photos, as well as access our agenda and speaker bios. You can also send messages to other attendees. I also hope that we can, Claire and Greg both mentioned some memos that have come out and are coming out, that we can actually leverage this forum to get you those memos to help spread the good word about what they're doing. And don't forget, as you go outside in the foyer in the same room as the coffee, and the Lafayette and Farragut Square rooms, we have all our exhibitors and sponsors who can tell you about what they're doing, and it's really some incredible things. So at 10:15, we'll have a few minutes with our exhibitors, and then we'll move into our sessions. And trying to help you navigate, to our left, to my left, will be the Independence BC, which will host the Problem with the Problem statement. To my right is Independence HI, which has government initiatives to improve services acquisition. Also to the left is BC and DE. DE will have the value of supplier relationship management. And also to the right is FG, the Cybersecurity Resilient Organization. And after that first set of sessions, we'll come back, meet here for lunch, where we'll have the Chief Acquisition Officer Awards, and with our lunch keynote speaker, Ann Run. So thank you for joining us here this morning, and we look forward to seeing everybody back here at lunch. Please participate. Thank you.
Thank you.